What do we do in here? You want to know about my life too? I basically live on the couch. I get here around 9 o'clock.
The king of the Klondike, Tony Beets, stood before a judge to hear his sentence. For years, millions of fans watched him battle the frozen north and pull fortunes from the ground. But one fiery stunt, filmed for the whole world to see, brought his entire empire to its knees. This was not just about a fine. It was a verdict that threatened to silence his million-dollar machines forever and force a final, heartbreaking goodbye. The Vikings Fire. The story of Tony Beets' downfall begins in the cold Yukon autumn of October 2014. On the banks of the Indian River, his most prized possession sat in a man-made pond. It was a colossal 75-year-old gold dredge, a relic from a bygone era that Tony had spent millions to bring back to life. This machine was his masterpiece, a symbol of his ambition to mine like the old-timers. But the old machine had sprung a leak, and its luck seemed to be running out. For the producers of Gold Rush, this was a perfect moment for television drama. The crew decided to perform a special ceremony to change the dredge's fortune. They called it a Viking baptism, a dramatic name for a dangerous idea. A welder named Mark Favron, who worked for Tony's company, was on his last day of the season. The work was done and the mood was light. He later testified in court that the whole thing was his idea, something he decided to do for fun while everyone was off the clock. He found a gas can that held about 7.5 liters, or 2 gallons, of gasoline. Before doing anything, he walked over to the boss. He asked Tony Beets if it was okay to pour the fuel into the water and set it on fire. According to Favron's sworn testimony, Tony's answer was simple and blunt. He said he did not give a single care. With that approval, Favron poured about half the can of gasoline into the dredge pond. He did not know he was being filmed at the time and tried to get out of the frame when he saw the cameras. Another employee then threw a lit torch onto the water's surface. In an instant, the pond erupted into a massive ball of fire. The flames shot high into the air, a spectacular and dangerous sight. The Gold Rush cameras were rolling, capturing every moment. As the fire blazed behind him, Tony Beets stepped into the shot. He looked straight at the camera and shouted the words that would come back to haunt him. He yelled, "I told you guys, come hell or high water, did not I? How do you like that?" It was a powerful scene, perfect for television. But that one moment, created for entertainment, was about to trigger a real-world legal battle that would threaten everything Tony had ever built. Judgment Day in the Yukon. In February 2015, the episode titled Hundreds of Ounces aired on the Discovery Channel. Millions of viewers watched the dramatic Viking baptism, a fiery spectacle in the middle of the Yukon wilderness. But not everyone was entertained. The stunt caught the attention of government officials. Shortly after the episode was broadcast, enforcement officers from Environment Canada, based in Yellowknife, saw the scene and filed a formal complaint with Yukon's chief mining inspector, Robert Savard. An official investigation was launched immediately. The wheels of justice began to turn against the king of the Klondike. Tony Beets and his mining company, Tamarack Inc., were formally charged with breaking the law. The charges were serious violations of the Yukon Waters Act. Tony himself was accused of 2 offenses: allowing waste, in this case gasoline, to be deposited into a water management area, and then failing to report the spill to an inspector. His company, Tamarack Inc. CO, where Tony was a director, faced the exact same charges, plus 2 more for failing to follow the rules of its water license. The maximum penalty for these crimes was severe, a fine of up to $100,000, 1 year in jail, or both. The case went to trial in a Whitehorse courtroom. The key piece of evidence against Tony Beets was the very television show that had made him famous. The Crown prosecutor, Megan Sealing, played the 30-second clip of the fiery stunt for the judge to see. The dramatic scene, with its swelling music and proud narration, was now Exhibit A in a criminal proceeding. Tony's defense lawyer, Andre Ruthman, tried to downplay the incident. He called the whole case a tempest in a teacup, arguing that only a small amount of gasoline was used and that his famous client was being targeted by the authorities simply because he was a reality TV star. But the judge, Peter Chisholm, was not convinced. On August 25, 2017, he delivered his verdict. Tony Beets and Tamarack Inc. were found guilty on all charges. Judge Chisholm made it clear that polluters in the Yukon would be treated seriously by the courts. He stated that Tony, as an experienced miner and the man in charge, could have easily prevented the stunt from happening, but he chose not to. Instead, the judge said, Tony fully participated in the spectacle for the benefit of the cameras and sensationalized the event for TV. The judge also made a point that would have huge consequences later. He found that Tony Beets had shown no remorse for his actions. The final sentence was handed down. Tony Beets was not going to jail. Instead, he and his company were ordered to pay a combined total of $31,000 in fines. Tony personally was fined $6,000, while Tamarack Inc. was fined $25,000. For a man who regularly pulls millions of dollars of gold from the ground, it seemed like a small price to pay. But the true punishment was not about the money. The real sentence was just about to begin. A $31,000 fine was a drop in the bucket for Tony Beets. His operation is so massive that his fuel bill alone can hit $100,000 in just a couple of weeks. But the guilty verdict came with a hidden cost, a consequence far more damaging than any fine. It was a black mark on his permanent record that would poison his relationship with the very government officials who held the keys to his kingdom. The real sentence was the loss of his water licenses. In the Yukon, a water license is everything. It is the legal permission you need to use water for mining. Without a valid water license, a mining operation is dead in the water. You cannot run a wash plant, you cannot move dirt, you cannot sluice for gold. You cannot so much as lift a single finger on your claim. And after being convicted of illegally polluting a dredge pond, Tony Beets found himself in a bureaucratic nightmare. His most important water license, the one for his claims on the Indian River, expired. This was the exact location where his two multi-million-dollar dredges were sitting, the centerpieces of his entire operation. When he tried to get the license renewed, he was met with resistance. The Yukon Water Board now had serious concerns about his past performance. The conviction from the Viking fire incident was a major problem. To make matters worse, authorities had also asked him to provide detailed reclamation plans for some of his other claims, which is a plan for how you will restore the land after mining. He never provided the documents they asked for, which only deepened their concerns. Suddenly, the king of the Klondike was powerless. His greatest and most expensive ambition, the two gigantic dredges he had poured millions of dollars and years of work into, were forced to shut down. They sat silent and useless in their ponds, unable to operate without a water license. This was the true meaning of the phrase, goodbye forever. It was not goodbye to Tony Beets. It was goodbye to his dream. It was goodbye to the project that defined his legacy on Gold Rush. The fallout from that one fiery moment, filmed for television, had now crippled the heart of his empire. The stunt cost him far more than $31,000. It cost him millions in lost gold and put the entire future of the Beets family business in serious doubt. Forging an empire from scratch? To truly understand how devastating this was, you have to understand how far Tony Beets had come. He was not born into a mining dynasty. He was born Anton Beets in 1959 in a small town called Wiedenis in the Netherlands. He grew up on a family farm, learning the value of hard work from a very young age. His days were spent milking cows and doing whatever was needed to help his family make ends meet. His life took a serious turn when he was still a teenager. His father suffered a terrible accident, and young Tony had to step up and take over running the family farm, often managing men who were twice his age. This early responsibility shaped him. He developed a tough, no-nonsense attitude and a powerful drive to succeed. But as he got older, he became skeptical about the future of farming in the Netherlands. He wanted more. In 1980, he and his new wife Minnie made the biggest decision of their lives. They decided to emigrate to Canada, a vast country full of opportunity. They arrived with very little money, just a few $100s to their name, and a powerful determination to build a new life from scratch. Their Canadian dream did not begin with gold. It began on another farm. Tony's first job was working on a dairy farm near a town called Salmon Arm in British Columbia. But it did not take long for a new goal to form in his mind. He started hearing stories about the Yukon, the legendary land of the Klondike gold rush. He heard that miners up north were making as much as $1,000 a week, a huge amount of money at the time. Tony decided right then that he was going to make that kind of money too. He was so determined that he bought a plane ticket and flew to Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon. But his timing was off. He had arrived too early in the season, before the ground had thawed and before any mining jobs were available. He had to fly back to the farm, but he did not give up on his dream. He left the dairy farm and went to work on the oil pipelines in Alberta, biding his time. Finally, while working in the oil patch, he got the call he had been waiting for. He had landed a job in a Yukon gold mine. The farm boy from Holland had finally made it to the land of gold, ready to start his long climb to the top. Tony Beets may have started at the bottom of the mining world, working as a simple machine operator. But he was never going to stay there for long. He lived by a simple rule he had set for himself back on the farm in Holland. If he was not a foreman within a week of starting a new job, something was wrong. His drive and work ethic were impossible to ignore. He and Minnie worked tirelessly 7 days a week during the short mining season, saving every dollar they could. Their hard work paid off. After years of working for another company called Tamarack Inc., the older owners decided they wanted to retire. Tony and Minnie saw their chance. They put together a deal and bought the entire company, claims and all. In one bold move, Tony went from being an employee to being the boss. He was now a mine owner in the Klondike, and he had big plans. The 1980s were a tough time for gold mining. The price of gold had crashed, and many miners went broke and abandoned their claims. Tony saw this as an opportunity. While others were getting out, he was getting in, buying up cheap land and mineral rights, slowly and carefully building his empire piece by piece. He earned a reputation as a tough, shrewd, and sometimes profane boss, a larger-than-life character who was not afraid to take huge risks. $1 million gamble. His biggest risk and his greatest obsession was to bring back a forgotten way of mining. All around the Yukon were the ghosts of the first gold rush, massive ancient machines called dredges that had been left to rust where they stopped working decades ago. Most miners saw them as worthless scrap. Tony saw them as money-making machines. He believed that a dredge, while expensive to get running, could pull gold out of the ground for a fraction of the cost of modern methods, making even low-grade ground profitable. In Season 5 of Gold Rush, viewers watched as Tony made the biggest gamble of his career. He spent $1 million to buy a 75-year-old dredge that was located over 150 miles away from his claim. It was in hundreds of pieces and had not run in decades. The task of moving and rebuilding it seemed impossible. The dredge weighed over 3,000 tons, and each piece had to be carefully disassembled, loaded onto trucks, and driven over treacherous Yukon roads. The project took multiple seasons and millions of dollars. The world watched as Tony and his crew battled breakdowns, frozen ground, and countless setbacks to put the giant puzzle back together. There were moments when it seemed like it would never work. He nearly crushed his own son under a conveyor belt during the disassembly. But Tony's stubborn determination pushed them forward. When they finally succeeded, it cemented his legend. He was no longer just Tony Beets. He was the Viking, the king of the Klondike. The dredge was the crown jewel of his kingdom, a symbol of his ambition and his connection to the old-time miners he respected so much. And it was this very same dredge, his greatest triumph, that sat in the middle of the pond he decided to set on fire for a TV stunt. As Tony's empire grew, a new challenger appeared on the scene. A young mining prodigy named Parker Schnabel came to the Klondike looking to make a name for himself. At just 18 years old, Parker needed land to mine, and Tony Beets was the one who had it. This was the beginning of one of the most famous rivalries in gold rush history. Their relationship was complicated. At times, Tony was a mentor, offering advice to the young miner. But most of the time, they were fierce competitors. Tony leased Parker some of his ground, but he charged him incredibly high royalties. Parker had to give Tony a huge percentage of all the gold he found, sometimes as much as 20 or 30%. This created constant tension between the two camps. They were locked in battles over land boundaries, water access, and who could pull the most gold out of the ground. The rivalry was a classic clash of styles. Tony was the old-school king, relying on his decades of experience and his love for massive old machinery. Parker was the young prince, using modern technology and a more efficient, data-driven approach to mining. Their arguments were legendary. Tony would often show up at Parker's claim to check on his progress, and it usually ended in a shouting match. Despite the conflict, there was a level of respect. Tony saw the same drive in Parker that he had in himself as a young man. But business was business, and Tony never gave Parker an easy day. This constant battle for supremacy became a central storyline of Gold Rush, pushing both miners to achieve incredible results season after season. Building an empire is one thing, but holding it together is another. As Tony's operation grew, so did the pressures and conflicts. His kingdom was constantly under siege, not just from rival miners, but from battles within his own family. All three of his children who work in the business, Kevin, Mike, and Monica, have been featured on Gold Rush, and the family dynamic has always been a source of drama. Tony is a tough boss to everyone, and he is even tougher on his own kids. His style is to micromanage every detail, and his constant criticism and control often led to explosive arguments. The most intense conflict was between Tony and his oldest son, Kevin. Kevin is a talented mechanic and a smart mine boss in his own right, but he grew increasingly frustrated with his father's refusal to give up control. For season after season, viewers watched them clash over everything from equipment repairs to mining strategy. Kevin felt he was never trusted to make his own decisions. Tony would often undermine him, barking orders over the radio and second-guessing his every move. The tension finally reached a breaking point, and Kevin made the difficult choice to leave the family operation and start his own mine. Surprisingly, Tony supported the move, leasing his son some ground and equipment to get him started. It was a tough decision, but it was the only way for Kevin to prove he could be his own man. The stress of the business affected everyone. Monica and Mike also had their share of arguments with their father. Working for family is never easy, especially when your father is a domineering figure like Tony Beets. All of these existing tensions were made worse by the legal problems that followed the Viking fire. With the dredges shut down because of the water license issues, the entire Beets operation was under immense financial pressure. They were losing millions of dollars in potential gold, and the stress was taking its toll on everyone. The family arguments became more frequent and more intense. The cracks in the foundation of the Beets dynasty were beginning to spread, threatening to bring the whole kingdom crashing down. The gambles and the glory. Despite the legal troubles and family drama, Tony Beets' career has been filled with incredible moments of triumph. He is a gambler at heart, always willing to risk it all for a massive payday. This has led to some of the biggest gold hauls in the history of the show. In one legendary week during Season 7, Tony's dredge pulled in a record-breaking amount of gold, a massive haul that left everyone speechless. He has had weigh-ins of over 500 ounces and even one that topped 694 ounces worth well over $1 million. These are the moments that built his reputation as the king of the Klondike. But it is not just about the gold. Tony has a deep respect for the history of the Yukon, and sometimes his machines unearth relics from the past. In one memorable episode, his crew discovered a massive mammoth tusk while digging, a direct link to the Ice Age animals that once roamed the land. Of course, for every moment of glory, there is a moment of struggle. The Yukon is an unforgiving place. Tony and his crew are in a constant battle against the elements. They face frozen ground that is as hard as concrete, equipment that breaks down at the worst possible moment, and a short mining season that puts them under constant pressure. Viewers have watched Tony's million-dollar dredge sink into its pond and seen his wash plants grind to a halt because of mechanical failures. But it is his ability to overcome these challenges that defines him. He never gives up, always finding a way to fix the problem and get back to work. Despite the years of struggle that followed his conviction, despite watching his multi-million-dollar dredges sit silent and useless, and despite the feuds that threatened to tear his family apart, Tony Beets kept fighting. He shifted his focus to other claims like Paradise Hill, running his wash plants and trommels and finding new ways to get the gold. He has made it clear that he has no plans to retire. When asked about it, he often says he will leave the Klondike in a box, and not a moment sooner. The king of the Klondike did receive a sentence, but it was not the one people thought. His real punishment was not a fine or a jail cell. It was the bureaucratic nightmare that cost him years of production and crippled his greatest ambition. It was the harsh lesson that in the modern world, not even a king can ignore the rules. Tony Beets survived his sentence, but his story serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly a hard-won empire can be brought to the very edge by a single, reckless moment.